Seeing that our Google Meet, in which I was going to go through what Marxist literary theory is, was an absolute gong show, I thought I would make a video that would allow you to go back and look at the slideshow, as well as have background information as to what it is and how we use it when we're examining a story. So, with any given story, you always read it first from a formalist perspective, which is analyzing it using literary devices. So you're looking for those devices to bring it meaning. When we read it through the first time, that meaning is absolutely valid and often is connected to the meaning that we will have when we're looking at it from a Marxist perspective. The key thing is that I have chosen these stories connected to the theories that we're applying very specifically, is that we can look at it from this perspective because the story lends itself to that perspective. However, the big picture here is that if you were to analyze a different story, we now have three different perspectives. We technically have four, but I won't get into that. In this particular video, we have reader response, which is our own perspective and interpretations, which is one that we don't typically use, but is important to recognize. We have formalist approach, where we solely use literary devices, and we did that with spaces between stars. Then we introduced the feminist perspective, which was touching bottom, and now a pair of silk stockings is going to connect to Marxist literary theory. And while I was reading through all of your responses for spaces between stars, there was one response in particular that really got to me because it examined the story in a roundabout way for a feminist perspective, and I thought that was interesting. So if I was to analyze spaces between stars and we were to switch theories, so we read it for the devices first, and then if we were to apply a different theory, then we examine what parts of the story emerge from that perspective. And just to give you an idea, so we looked at mostly the symbolism of fishes and stars in which to examine the story or bring meaning to the story, because we were examining it from a formalist approach, which means we're using those symbols and those literary devices to bring about the meaning. If I was to bring in a feminist perspective, it was interesting how Maya used Evan and the boy on TV as a role model rather than her aunt. And so we would look at feminine characters, we would look at masculine characters, and we would look at the inequality, whether it was represented through the protagonist or what it was. So that's what all of these theories are, is that while I have selected stories that lend themselves very easily to examining it from these perspectives, the idea is that if we were to take all of these, we can examine the kite runner and look for symbolism, and that's what you're doing in your active reading notes. It's really from a formalist approach. If we were to bring in feminist theory or even Marxist theory, we would be examining inequalities either based on gender, or we would be examining inequalities based on income. And I think as I said that, things were flashing through my head about how the Taliban would have created inequalities for the women, or how women were represented within that story, or lack thereof. And on the flip side, if we were to look at the money and wealth that Amir's family had over Hassan's, we could look at the inequality that happens between their class-based system, how Amir was a Hazar. It's blanking right now. Hazara is what I was trying to think about. So, I've somewhat introduced what Marxist theory is. The concept is that we are examining inequality between individuals or groups based on the economic systems that society operates with. So when we look at Karl Marx's theory, and Friedrich and Engels was also another key theorist who was involved in looking at society. They were sociologists. They looked at society and they were looking for, typically what sociologists do, they were looking for problems and the origins of those problems. And for these individuals, we were looking for these two theorists. They were looking at the idea of how the class-based system was creating a system of inequality that would perpetuate itself. So based on a class-based system, where originally in the beginning, starting with feudalism and moving towards a capitalist society where we had factory owners and workers, that it was believed that this economic system in which there was owners and there was workers was inherently unequal, that the balance of power was not equal, and that it wouldn't be equal until the economic system was in itself equal. Because some people have lots more money than others, those people with money in a capitalist society have advantages over others based on their social, economic, and political class. And so often what this looks like in our society in particular, those that have money have access to power and resources that those who are poor do not. And so we'll look a little bit later on as to what that looks like in today's society. But it is the idea that if you have money, you have access to the resources that will continue to support your economic status. And on the flip side, if you are in the lower class or poor class and you do not have money, it is very, very difficult to get out of that class and to be in any other class because of the lack of power and access to resources that you have. So we're going to look at the relationship between power and money. Who has money, who has power, and what is the quality of life for the characters that are connected to this system. In here, I have a couple of videos that I would like you to watch. Hopefully they help you. This one in particular, I'd like you to start at 140. It's really fast and it's a really quick video in terms of the pace that they're just flying through all these concepts, and it can be overwhelming. So at 1 minute 40, there is an explanation of feudalism moving into capitalist society, just to understand some of those concepts. This video in particular is a Powtoon. I find it very easy to understand. It is student made and does a very good job of explaining the basic concepts at a pace for a beginner who has never heard of Marxist theory before will be able to grasp some of those concepts. And this one down here is a great video that is from Khan Academy, and unfortunately it goes in a little bit of a direction that doesn't lend itself to literary analysis, but does a very good job in illustrating and understanding class-based systems. So what Marx examined is that in any given society, that where there is a class-based system, that there will be inequality. So Marx was even examining, and in that first video you'll actually see it, the idea of hunters and gatherers or primitive communism, is that when going back to primitive days, men and women and everyone in the group had a specific role. You would have leaders, as every human group needs to have leaders. However, roles were evenly distributed, and every role was valued and important to their survival. However, when we start moving into some of these other systems, that we start to have a divide as to people who have money and their role, and people who do not, or the working class and their role in society as well. So what Marx examined is that he identified the rich and the poor, and he identified them using the names of bourgeoisie, which were the rich, and proletariat, which is the working class. And when he examined these two groups, he found that when there was a group that had more money than others, they maintained the power in society. So the wealthy class lives off the production of the worker. The wealthy class maintains all the profits of production, while the worker only maintains minimum wage. And often the owner will keep profits high by keeping the wages for the workers just enough so that they continue to have to work. But the interesting thing is that wages were often so low that the items that the workers were making, they often couldn't afford themselves because those wages were so low, therefore making their profits higher. And even though there was many more workers than there was bosses, they often kept them at a disadvantage, that it was better to have a job than it wasn't, that if they tried to rise together to go against the boss could fire them, and then they would be without their low wages to begin with. And so this was the never-ending cycle of people who needed to work, and the profits that the rich were continuing to reap the benefits of their labor. So what we did in the Google Meet, and unfortunately we didn't have an opportunity to do this as a whole class, but would be something that would be really important to look at, is in these areas, in what ways are those who come from a lower income or lower income bracket, what disadvantages do they have when it comes to these areas? So some things that we were looking at was, because it's easier to, if you have money, you have access to all the resources. So if you don't have a lot of money, so we're talking about individuals who can maybe pay all of their bills but not have much more spending power. Maybe they're even struggling for that. So we're considering even middle class because of the cost and access to some of these resources. So when we look at education, there is a reason why the cycle of poverty exists, and it's because if your parents are living in poverty or you are living in poverty, it is very, very difficult to come up with the money to go to post-secondary education. There are access to loans that you could get, but the problem is that now you're in a perpetual state of owing money. Had one friend of mine who borrowed, I think, over $40,000 in OSAP and was working in a government job making, I think it was $75,000 a year, and he had to pick and choose between whether he was paying back his student debt or if he was going to pay rent that month. And it was this constant, I think it took him over 10 years to pay off his student loans, paying a high amount every year. And the idea of whether you go to school or not because of the amount of money that you have or that you need to borrow. Access to government assistance, and I've talked about this one before. In order to do that, you have to have internet, you have to have a bank account, you have to have a home residence that is permanent, you need to have a computer or a device in which to log in, you need to have a number of things, and there's a number of barriers there that may actually prohibit you from getting government assistance. What type of jobs were lost when it came to COVID? Those with higher income jobs often didn't lose their jobs. Now, I realize businesses are going under because of COVID, but in this particular case, I'm just looking at workers. And I know that anybody in the service industry often lost their job, and those are lower paying jobs than, say, a permanent job in government, whatever it may be. Healthcare, we can even look at the idea of if you are working, you have access to healthcare, which allows you dental benefits and prescription benefits, eyewear, prosthetics, all of these other things, that if you don't have a full-time job, if you don't have a job above minimum wage, that often it is very difficult to access these extra parts of healthcare. And last but not least, materialism. So the idea of having status based on the items that you're wearing or driving, whatever it may be, and whether or not as an individual you have access to the items that give you status or clout within society. Realizing I'm running out of time, I'm going to finish up this slideshow in another video. Thank you for paying attention for this one.